this introduction will be a little different than the one I did yesterday. The title of this presentation is Abusive Religious or Spiritual Group Dynamics Can Be Surrounded by Totalism That Needs Equipment Resources to Truly Break Free from Deception and Restrictive Bondage. This is descriptive in one sense in terms of the process, the methodology of the groups that the ones that I introduced yesterday into my presentation. Also, the issue of recovery. I think that's such a critical area, especially for a gathering of this nature, in that people understand what happened to them, what were the methods used, what were the techniques used, So there's a process involved with this. And so my focus will be a little bit more on that side of it today, where I did an overview of the history of cultic groups in certain areas, but especially as it relates to the latter rain movement. That's a particular category, and I covered the issue of cult types of groups, types of organizations. So they all have different appeals depending on the type of group. An Eastern mystical group is going to have a very different appeal to the person that gets involved versus a Bible-oriented group, where the Bible is something that is the real ultimate authority in that relationship. So then you have subcategories, and when you get into certain types of groups, there's different organizations, and even within types you can have specific groups that appeal to people in different ways. To go to a self-help training of one kind or another may get you into Buddhism. It may get you into various forms of Eastern mysticism. If you join a UFO organization, you could end up in a cultic group, which is a whole different category and has whole different dimensions to it. And I showed visuals yesterday of just examples of various types of cults or different types of organization. But what we notice when they become totalistic is that there are group dynamics, there's group methods involved. So it's important to recognize how these categories work. And in my own experience, I was exposed to a blending of two types. The Church of the Living Word that I got involved with, a group also known as The Walk, there were really occult metaphysics involved with that particular group. I knew nothing about it. I really didn't have a background. I came up from a more traditional Protestant mainstream kind of background. So when people came at me with, what is an apostle, I couldn't tell you, what the qualifications would be. I remember when I first heard about Agabus. Who's Agabus? He's in the New Testament. He's in the book of Acts. And it's like, I knew nothing about Agabus. He was a New Testament prophet, by the way. So they captured my attention when telling me certain things or sharing certain things with me. Now, what's very interesting about when you look at the history of cults and cult leaders, various authors have written some really interesting books, even seminal magazine articles. So the history of cult leaders that began in the United States, with the exception of Eastern cults, many began from mainstream Christian denominations. Sun Myung Moon, for example, we just heard Alan speak, Alan Tate Wood, yesterday and today. He was a member of the Unification Church, more commonly called the Moonies. Moon himself was raised in a missionary Presbyterian home, so he came from that type of background, but we're talking about Korea. And with Korea, you get this syncretism of Eastern traditions mixing in there. And so Sun Myung Moon crossed that lines. And when you look at Jim Jones, for example, of the People's Temple in the Guyana jungle, there you see Jim Jones with those dark glasses there. And right next to that picture is the pavilion where over 900 and some Americans died. Now, sometimes you hear this terminology of mass suicide. Not everyone died by suicide. They had weapons there. I mean, you're talking people that was at the point of a gun. Jim Jones himself was shot in the head. You're talking about people who had needles with cyanide in them, and it was forced on them, and they didn't want to die. And then you had these zealots. Whatever Jim Jones said, they were amening him, and they were going along with each statement he was making. And that whole event, when they were dying, was recorded on audio tape. So if the technology back then, they had these really nice digital cameras, I wouldn't be surprised if Jones might have had done that way. That's my own personal speculation. 2 cents, by the way. So he was involved with the interdenominational charismatic church and also pastored a Disciples of Christ church, which was an offshoot of the Restoration movement of the 1830s. So yesterday we saw in the historical context, you had the Restoration movement of the 1830s, and a lot of the groups that people would hear about today, whether it's the Mormons, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or you hear of the Jehovah's Witnesses, or you hear about the Seventh-day Adventists. There were quite a few seminal groups at that time that had their beginnings in the 1830s. The Church of Christ was one of them. Jim Jones became a pastor of the Disciples of Christ. And what's very interesting about that, he was not defrocked, despite all of the revelations that were coming out. Leo J. Ryan, who was a congressman, and I happen to have the honor of serving on the board of the Leo J. Ryan Education Foundation. We built that organization in honor of the congressman who gave his life trying to help his constituents. Over 1,000 of those constituents had written to him. And so he went on a fact-finding mission to find out what happened down there. I had a chance to meet members of his family, his daughters especially. Patricia Ryan became a friend of mine personally. And it is quite a story. I mean, if you hear all the details that led up to Jonestown. So I want to get into the methodology of how those things develop. Moses David Berg, the founder of the Children of God or the Family, came out of a Christian Missionary Alliance background. Victor Paul Weirwool, in fact, the successor to Victor Paul was on the left part of your screen, L. Craig Martindale. He had to step down from the leadership of his organization due to the scandals that came up. And it's very interesting. Scandals were catching up with Jim Jones. And so he took all his people down there to Guyana to get away from the scrutiny and the accountability that would eventually cost all of them their lives, including himself. He was shot in the head, but we don't know who actually did it, who pulled the trigger, who actually killed him. Then you have other groups, and since we started at 10:30, hopefully I want to get in the Tony and Susan Alamo Foundation. I want to show you a video overview of them in light of that coming up yesterday, in yesterday's exchange that we had here. Both Apostle John Robert Stevens, founder of the Walk, was a former pastor of a Foursquare denomination, and also went to an Assembly of God school, Life Bible College in the Los Angeles area. Sam Fife was an ex-Baptist preacher and became the founder of the Move, or the Body of Christ. You saw that with Vengeance is Ours. I showed you the chapter and in fact, here's the book. It's called Vengeance is Ours. I recommend anybody that's had exposure to the Move or the Walk that they really should read this book. It's the most comprehensive overview in one volume that deals with the influence of these two groups and the movement that it's associated with. The common theme cult leaders practice is that they all started describing themselves in opposition to their local church, denomination, or the Christian community at large. You heard Lori share about being, the whole involvement with being involved with the true church. You have the ultimate truth with a capital T. You have the highest form of that. And so when it's presented in an absolute black and white kind of way, and what I mean by that, if you aren't part of the restoration, you're in Babylon. Now, here's a quote from the leader that I was under. Babylon is against the restoration and the divine order God is bringing forth. And a lot of times that would be in contrast to the old order versus the new order. Even in Nazi Germany, this type of language was used. If you look at what the Nazis claimed during their time period. And this is a continuation from Stephen's quote. Remember that we are not against God's people in any way. I went, what? I mean, who are truly God's people? Friends of mine? Or if they're not part of this restoration, then they're part of Babylon. There was this cognitive dissonance that I had to struggle through all that. Like other cults that teach that Christians as Babylon and that God will be judging them for persecuting the saints who do not agree with them, the fear of God's wrath or displeasure for questioning or leading the cult is a very powerful hold on you. Sun Myung Moon, founder of the Unification Church, more commonly called the Moonies, was switching a page and it flipped back. One of the things that happens is that it removes the legitimate alternatives or options that create a trap that puts you in a position where you don't have a remedy. If you don't go along with the group, you don't comply with the group, it really creates a remedy issue. How are you going to remedy this cognitive dissonance that you're experiencing? This is one of the main reasons cult members endure so much abuse, because they are believers in a group who have the ultimate truth indoctrination process, and they feel trapped. And you get to the point where you don't know how to live with that, and then it builds up over time on you. After you feel trapped, then the cult must provide the answer by the group's design. Those in the highest cult leadership positions are above or avoid confrontation or accountability. Now, the thing that I mean by that is that the leaders become beyond confrontation. If you think of confronting them, you really have to weigh the consequences. And when you're in a group and you know the consequences, and the reason I mention this is you see what happens to other people when they are considered rebellious or they have an independent spirit. Critical thinking really becomes a problem when you're dealing with that kind of influence. Cults are characterized by a pyramid authority structure, and I touched on that yesterday. The shepherding or discipleship approach to training members. So there's where the authority and the submission relationships are enforced by compliance doctrines, and behavior rules must be imposed and obeyed. Penalties and punishment will be applied due to lack of conformity. So if you're not complying, there's this issue of consequences. True free will and lack of informed consent are missing under these coercive limits, and true autonomy is lacking. What is striking about former members of the Move testimonies that I've heard of are extreme examples of physical and sexual abuses being cited. Also, the ongoing fears associated with being sent to ISOT. The relationship between groups and how they discipline you. And even in the case of Jim Jones, people were very afraid of disagreeing with him. In fact, I remember one mother giving her testimony that her daughter was beaten 75 times with a board. And you know what that daughter's reaction was? She was appreciative that a church that loved her so much to be beaten like that. Now she understands the rules of the church. And I'll never forget the mother's feedback as a group member before she left. She said, there was no accurate feedback. There was no place I could go. And I could say, well, that was a terrible thing that they just did. Because everyone else in the group was telling her what a good thing it was. See, this is the kind of thing that creates the abuse cycle, and it gets to the point where you can't take it anymore. Some people don't make it. They commit suicide. I know a number of examples of the suicide becomes the outcome because they see no alternative or no option of escape from that kind of abuse. And it is important to ask yourself, is the world a threatening place or a safe place? Now, Walter Martin wrote a book called The Kingdom of the Cults. This is the new one that came out. In fact, this particular book that came out in the 80s called The New Cults by Walter Martin has a full chapter on the Church of the Living Word in it. It's the first time I had seen a systematic analysis of the practices and the deeper teachings that the walk expressed. It was in that particular book. So, but in his Kingdom of the Cults, the psychological structure of cultism, in chapter 3, he describes the psychological process from a psychologist whom he had spoken with. He says in the psychological structure of cultism, the first and foremost, the belief system of cults are characterized by a closed-mindedness. Such belief systems are in isolation and lack logical consistency. They exist in what we might describe as separate compartments in the cultist mind and are almost incapable of penetration or disruption if the individual cultist is completely committed to the authority pattern of their organization. So it really is a big deal depending on how you look at the authority structure. Secondly, the closed-minded belief systems are characterized by a genuine antagonism on a personal level to those who do not agree with the group teaching or leadership decisions. And you see this in interpersonal relationship. People that were previously close, I experienced it personally. People that I was really close to before I got involved with my group. And then once they bought into the worldview of the walk, when I was having problems and questioning it, Winnie, who didn't make it, was questioning it and was having problems with the authority and the submission, and just especially the public display of this kind of public, well, I call it public humiliation. A group wants to make an example of you so that others won't give them trouble. They really put a heavy discipline on them, and they make them a public example so that you're afraid of doing the same thing, because you know the consequences that are going to come your way if you cross certain lines with the authority and the teaching and the obedience in the relationship cycle. And it continues. And one of the things that comes out in this antagonism is the surrender of individual autonomy and decisions to the cult leaders, so that when it comes to making choices and thinking things critically, you can't come to the conclusion they're wrong. A repeated teaching was, you must obey your leaders even if they are wrong. You must submit to the new or divine order because they are appointed by God, and you are under their covering and protection from the enemy or satanic attacks. So if you don't have that covering, you're not protected. So the authority is literally tied into your personal safety. And God will honor you for your submission to those who have authority over you. Remember what Alan said about Sun Myung Moon and standing before God on Judgment Day. Again, this is designed to work that way. So, if one is able to provide neutral and objective source of information, this is really important to interacting with somebody that's in a group that has this kind of mindset. I know when I work with people in intervention work, I have to be really careful how I'm presenting myself, not just the content of what I'm saying. Credibility is a really important matter when you're dealing with this, because cult groups have a conspiratorial mindset towards outsiders, and so the sources of information are highly tainted. You could have the best information in the world, but if it's tainted and it's not coming from a sincere place, you've got credibility problems. Walter Martin also points out, since all systems of authority in cult organizations indoctrinate their members to believe that anyone who opposes their beliefs cannot be motivated by any other than blind prejudice, ignorance, or satanic forces. Notice what that does. You have credibility challenges at that point. And so the group has a tremendous amount of power over, you're free, like your free will, you can do what you want. But if you don't trust what you're listening to, and it has no credibility, it's going to have no impact on you. I liken it to water rolling off a duck's back. There's not going to be penetration. They may hear you, but it's not penetrating. So Robert J. Lifton, in his classic work, Thought, Reform, and the Psychology of Totalism, that's the title of his book. There it is, up here on the screen. In chapter 22, he has 8 psychological themes. And they're really important ones, because when you're dealing with ideological totalism, there is a psychological framework that it goes with. Milieu control, for example, is a French word for the environment. But what's really important, what Lifton describes, is not just the external environment. We have an external environment in this room. But if you're in a totalistic kind of context, the external environment's a big thing. And both of our groups that I was in and those who had been in the MOVE, they had these farms. They had these communities separated. Now, I know that in the San Francisco Bay Area, if you went to a Unification Church retreat, you went on a bus and you went a couple hours. And I've heard testimony of people saying when they were going to this place at night with the lights on inside the bus. Do you know what happens when the lights are on inside a bus and people are constantly talking? You don't know where you are. You don't know where you're going. And so keeping a person busy to the point that they get there. But the isolated environment is the physical part of it. So that Lifton describes in his chapter 22 what you see, what you hear, what you read, what you write, what you feel or express. That's the part that really has the initial impact on a lot of people in terms of the totalism and the reinforcement that goes with it. Planned spontaneity is one of his characteristics that he points out in chapter 22. Things that look natural are actually highly planned. They aren't spontaneous. They're made to look that way, but they're not actually that way. The person sitting next to you was assigned by the cult. You don't know anything about the background. The stages that they were going to put you through, like humorous moments that were planned and timed to be there at a certain point. And the laughter is not natural laughter. It's not spontaneous. It's a laughter that's meant to be there at a certain time. So, and I know that other groups where if you go to their workshops, the chairs are perfectly measured, and everything in the room has this precise exactness to it. And part of the subconscious influence that's hitting the person is the precision of what's going on in that learning experience. So that those are just some elements of it. But the more important part of the brainwashing process that he describes in his 8 psychological themes is the issue of projection, where individuals have the ideological totalists accuse them of crimes they did not commit or things that they have not done. And I've heard many testimony over the years where people were accused of things that were not true, but the group members accepted without question. Now, how is it that you get people to accept things beyond question? They're not fact-checking. They're not investigating whether it's actually true or not. They accept what their leaders tell them. And you can talk with people that have known somebody for like 15 years. You're talking about people that live in these closed communities. They grew up together, played together, been indoctrinated together. They've done all kinds of things together, year in and year out. And just like that, when a leader says that they're guilty of adultery, which the woman says, hey, that never happened. I've been faithful to my husband and I have not violated that vow that I made. Other members don't believe it. If the leader said, the Holy Spirit, I had a personal friend that was accused of witchcraft, and I thought, I couldn't reconcile this with this guy's name was Mike. Everybody that knew him, that was part of the reason why our group broke down in the Philadelphia area, was credibility was a problem. We heard things with Winnie that we knew weren't factually true. So it was the struggle with that on a personal level is a big deal, especially when you're dealing with relationships of a lifetime. And I feel for any second generation person that lives with this, where they are separated from their mothers and their fathers and friends of a lifetime, relatives of a lifetime, because they're told things and the group members believe it without question because the leader said so. That's all it is. The non-thought process beyond that is absolutely incredible. And Lifton describes the non-thought response. In recovery from a cult, it is important to reevaluate the true factual history and false memory imposed upon a group member by the cult. One of the things I do in an intervention, and I've experienced this many times working with families, is that it's really important for us to review the factual history of what you've experienced. Not opinions, not interpretation. And there was if anybody remembers Dragnet, I know I'm dating myself, and they talked to Sergeant Friday, and he would go, just the facts, man, just the facts. But it's really important in terms of, if you're talking about truth and integrity, and this relates to a person on a really personal level. If you're really being violated, and you're being accused of things that aren't true, and you're made to own that, and you're being treated as though you're guilty. Think of it, you're being called a pedophile. And you're not a pedophile. You never did anything that a pedophile is guilty of. You haven't done it, it's not true. But it's a very easy thing for a cult to discredit you and just demolish your reputation. And there's not a single fact to back it up. Now you have the reverse thing, where in the cult they're hiding pedophilia by leaders who do this to children, you know. And there are situations where you may have a domestic area where pedophilia was part of the domestic side of the family. But that's not typical of most families. I mean, most families that I deal with are within, I would say, the mainstream of the American culture, the mainstream of American society. You know, they have responsible jobs. They want their children to go to college and get a good education so they can have a good career, raise their family, raise their children. These kinds of, you know, more central common things. Cults typically indoctrinate members to view their pre-cult life negatively, with disdain, in narrow black and white thinking. And I've seen it. I remember I was with a family, and Dr. Singer had referred them to me in the Bay Area of California. And I was visiting with the parents, and this mother pulled out 2 drawers just full of photographs of the family all over the place, and you could see the smiles, and they were just having a great time for these vacation spots that they had been to in the past. But their son's picture was in there, well, quite a few of them. And so when we were talking, and he was telling me how bad his former life was, and I'm watching this mother sitting there, and she's looking increasingly uncomfortable. And I remember these photographs that she had of her son enjoying himself. And I would take the photographs that she had, and he smiled. You could tell he was having a great time with his family. And he looked at these pictures, and there he was. He was locked up. What he was telling us was not matching these photographs. Remember another one where I was with a family in Pennsylvania, in the Poconos. And one of the things that the family really missed, he was in one of the early shepherding groups back then that was involved with the Florida Five. His sense of humor was gone. I mean, he was really known to crack jokes, and people were just loving him around. I mean, he was just a fun person to be with. But that was like somebody pulled the plug on it. And I asked people that knew him to share his sense of humor and what that really meant to his friends and what it meant to fellow family members and all that. And suddenly, his lips starts quivering. It was the first time we saw emotion, natural, spontaneous emotion. It wasn't that sullen, just, we call it a flat affect. There's just no natural spontaneity going on. Why I bring that up is the nature of what happens to a person when they go through a personality change. And okay, so what is common in most cult groups is control-oriented leadership. The authoritarian leadership approach is central to the group identity, where individuality is deprived and surrender of autonomy towards cult personality traits manifest themselves. The corporate Christ is a big thing in the manifest sons of God type of teaching. So this is the individuality issue, and I got permission from Laurie, so at some point I want to show you the Vainglory video that I have that gets into this, how individuality is broken down and how the group identity moves forward. And also, Professor Ron Enroth, retired at this point at Westmont College in Santa Barbara, and author of The Lure of the Cults. He did a magazine article called The Power Abusers. And so this is really interesting. He has, under The Power Abusers, when follow the leader becomes a dangerous game. And that is really a very serious thing, because the authority structure has a lot to do with how people relate to the Bible when you're dealing with the groups that we're talking about, whether it's the early latter rain, whether it's a shepherding movement, whether it's manifest sons of God, teaching organizations that emphasize those keen theological themes. Both Carl Stevens of the Bible Speaks, and he's not even related to John Robert Stevens. I found that fascinating when I encountered his group in the 80s. Both considered themselves apostles, and both were viewed themselves like unto Moses. That's a big claim. Because in John's gospel you have the law came through Moses, and grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. But it's the nature of that Moses position that they're taking as a chief intercessor. And so, if I remember, and you'll see it in the Vainglory film, if John Robert Stevens was attacked, we had to fast for him. Now, when I asked about fasting, how about people in the movement? People in the movement go through fasting sessions, or they had to go through fasting periods? Yeah. It was the first time in my life I fasted for 2 weeks. That really had an impact on me. I mean, I was weakened. I remember going to services. They could be 5 hours long. And I remember the lightheadedness that I had gone through. And they talked about the Shekinah glory. I saw the mist. I mean, the suggestibility issue here is a big thing if you're dealing with hypnotic type trance states, and what can happen when you're in a weakened position, when you're exposed to that. So it's really important in terms of the position of, just want to make sure. things he points out in the power abusers is the issue of the Greek in the New Testament. Now, I touched on some of this yesterday, but Enroth, when he talked to New Testament biblical scholars about the Greek of the New Testament, the word exousia does not have the connotation of jurisdiction over the personal lives of others. And that's one of the things you look at. If you look at the New Testament in terms of an overview from Matthew to Revelation, you don't see apostles choosing college or marriage partners, or you don't have specific statements about dating or not dating. And there's all this personal control that comes in that you don't find parallel examples in the New Testament. Not only that, but there are statements in the New Testament, which I will need to cover, that address some of these boundary violations. Derek Prince, one of the original Florida Five of the controversial Shepherd movement, claimed, whenever God's delegated authority touches our life, he requires us to acknowledge it, submit to it, just as we would to him in person. Notice, that's the direct parallel right there. You're obeying them as though you're obeying God directly. Man's fallible. We all make mistakes. We have human frailty, and also we have a human nature that throughout history has demonstrated all kinds of issues. Those individuals who claim to be Christian and need to be aware of those leaders who claim a direct word from the Lord. Enroth cautions concerning a particular person's finances, family matters, major life decisions such as a life partner or a career choice. Now here you have the authority system that was described by the Assemblies of God, just like they did with the latter rain paper I showed you yesterday concerning manifest sons of God. Speaking of the abuses that took place on there. I don't know if you can see it. This was a book written by Ron Burks, who's now a professional psychologist, PhD. It's called Damaged Disciples. Notice when it's on the top of the book, if you can read it, casualties of the authoritarian churches or shepherding movement. So the disciples go through a damaging process, and there's a lot of detail in this book about how that happens and how you can recover from it. The Assemblies of God, again, because they recognize the laddering roots of what happened in this particular movement, and so they put out an official publication describing its abuses and some of the teaching-related elements that go with it. So in Acts 17:11, and this is really important for those that would take the Bible seriously, you have various things that the Bible says about itself. John 17:17, thy word is truth. Notice Deuteronomy 4:2, the admonition that is given to Moses. Ye shall not add unto the word which I command you, neither shall ye diminish aught, but that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God which I command you. So, even in Proverbs, you have chapter 30, verses 5 and 6. Every word of God is pure. He is a shield unto them that put their trust in him. Add thou not unto his words, lest he reprove thee, and thou be found a liar. And that seems to be a real problem with cult groups when they are really cultic. It's deception. And the double ethic that you will find. Now, in terms of historic religion traditions and ethics, truth is a virtue. It's something sacred. It's something that's respected. When you're dealing with a cult, you have a double set of ethics. Margaret Singer was one of the first ones that pointed that out when I was learning from her. And she said, you have to be open and honest within the group, but it's okay to deceive and manipulate outsiders. What happened to integrity? What happened to the highway to holiness? I mean, this is where you run into credibility problems. I know in my group, the highway of holiness also meant they talk like truck drivers and sailors. I mean, I always have reconciliation issues with that one. Now, in Acts 17:11, you have, these were no more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with all readiness of mind, and searched the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so. Now, their translations will word that a little differently, but there I have the King James in particular. One of the basic translations we used, that was a group translation, I learned a lot of my verses this way, was through the New American Standard. For some reason, that was the preferred standard. Now, if you're in the International Churches of Christ, they like the New International Version. And I found with many groups that have a particular indoctrination process to them, the translation that they are absolute about has a lot to do with their teaching. Because if you read in other translations that don't go along with their teaching, the wording is different. And it's not so black and white. A classic one is the Jehovah's Witnesses. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Most people accept that in mainstream Christianity. The Jehovah's Witnesses is specifically different. The Word was a God. So for all the talk about one God, now you have two gods. You have a big God and a little God. Now, again, when you're dealing with groups that have indoctrination policies, then you have to look at, well, what's the authority structure that's behind it? So what you get are two classic hallmarks of authoritarian power are blind loyalty and unquestioning obedience. This is where the psychological part of it is really serious. And the blind trust to fallible humans can be dangerous, and the legacy of destructive cult groups in history in modern times demonstrates that even mass suicide like Jim Jones in the People's Temple, Heaven's Gate. It's interesting how you will find the Bible, and this was a UFO type group that eventually ended up with the death of those people in San Diego in that mansion. Heaven's Gate, does anybody remember Heaven's Gate, the internet group? Yeah. So, and then I mentioned yesterday 1 John 4:1, believe not every spirit. I also brought up 1 Thessalonians 5:21. And the one that's really critical here is, especially if we're talking the latter rain movement, manifest sons of God, the move, the walk, groups of this shepherding, this one's a big one. Mark 10:42. Yeah, it's on the bottom there. Okay, I'm going to read it. I'll just read it from there because everybody's looking at it. But Jesus called them to him and said unto them, now this is the apostles that he's addressing. Ye know that they which are accounted to rule over the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and their great ones exercise authority upon them. But so shall it not be among you. It's very important as we're talking the Roman Empire here, that had a pyramidal military structure under the authority of Caesar, who claimed to be God at that time, by the way. So you're dealing with ultimate authority. But Jesus is instructing his apostles not to exercise authority the same way that they do. So this issue of personal control is a major issue here. And Jesus forbid his apostles to exercise it in that manner. And there's more said about this. Now when I was in my group, and I talked to a lot of latter rain groups, all kinds of Bible cult groups, I did with college students for the last 30 or more years, they don't have this side of that teaching in my experience of working with them. So the mathetes, being a learner, is the Greek, but then you also have the word for authority, which is rooted in the tata kuriou. So the number there is, if you use Strong's concordance, you can look it up in a dictionary. Also, these numbers relate to other Bible tools. For example, Vine's expository dictionary. There's various lexicons that you can use. If you don't know Greek or Hebrew, you can look up those numbers and find out the original Greek or the original Hebrew. And so, to exercise dominion over, to be Lord over, that was considered wrong. Jesus did not want his apostles exercising authority in that manner. Also, we have Luke 22:25 to 26. Those two verses in Luke 22. And he said unto them, the kings of the Gentiles exercise lordship over them, and they exercise authority upon them to be called benefactors, a good worker or a philanthropist. But ye shall not, it shall not be so. Or ye shall, but ye shall not be so. Okay. But he is the greatest among you, let him be as the younger, and he is the chief, let him who does serve. Now, certain groups, the King James only is the way you have to do this. You can only do it in the King James, especially certain Pentecostal organizations have this particular restriction. So again, it has a lot to do with the central themes that they teach. Now, this goes from the the apostle level to the, I wanted to show you this in the Greek interlinear. It's up on the screen. Is there red dots there? No, that's not the one that has it. This just shows you in the original Greek next to the English what it looks like. And that's what this book is. It's called an interlinear. What an interlinear does, it gives you the actual English translation and it shows you word for word what the English and the Greek word is in parallel. I do that on purpose because the original Greek is a lot different than the English, like I shared yesterday, like the eye of the needle. There are words that have a specific Greek meaning that the English doesn't necessarily translate. Now, I heard the word hell come up a number of times that people talked about in their personal story. When you think of the English word hell, do you know there's 4 different Hebrew and Greek words for that? Does one know the difference between Sheol and Gehenna? Hades or Tartarus? Those are specific words in specific passages that mean specific things. Most groups that get into these passages don't go into that kind of detail about the specific meaning of words in their context. And that's a big deal with this, which I'm going to point out with this next passage. Okay, the Apostle Peter is addressing not only fellow elders, but the congregation as a whole. So this goes from the leadership level to the regular member, the laity, the regular member in the congregation. And this is Peter speaking, the apostle. The elders which are among you I exhort, who am also an elder, and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking oversight thereof, not by way of compulsion. And I'm going to show you that in the Greek. They're not allowed to do it that way. Neither are they able to do it by constraint, but what? Willingly. These groups really have a serious problem with this. Their way of authority is a molding kind of authority. It's one that creates compliance and submission and eventually can get to unquestioning obedience. And this is the big danger when you cross that line. These are safeguards to protect you. And notice, be of a ready mind. This does have to deal with the mind here. Notice in verse 3, neither being lords over God's heritage, but be examples to the flock. So, again, the Greek words here are crucial ones. Not to lord over or subjugate. You're not allowed to subjugate them. Now, when I go through these kind of passages with people that are in these kind of groups, this has a very profound effect on them. Because if you feel guilty because you're not submitting, why? Because God's authority is involved here. I'm doing the wrong thing. And if you own that and you take that internally, that's a big deal. Versus, I have second thoughts about this. Houston, we got a problem. You can't carry it through in that context if these kind of boundaries are being violated. And so I just think it's a big issue here. Another one is the book of Revelation. Oh, sorry. So in 1 Peter 5, if you see that little red X on the top section, not by way of compulsion, but willingly. And you'll see the nor on the end there. I just wanted to show you in the original Greek. And you're not supposed to exercise lordship, nor exercise lordship over the lots. So that's the original Greek. And I think it's very clear what it's saying. And I agree with Enroth when he pointed this out in his power abuse article. You also have the warning of Jesus in Revelation chapter 2. But this thou hatest, the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. And I look up in the Greek, well, what does the word hate mean there? Because hate in the English has a kind of a singular meaning, an intense disliking. In the New Testament, it is a very different word. And you need to know the specific Greek word that's behind that English word, or else you can come out with a totally wrong understanding of what it's actually telling you. In this case, it's Jesus has an intense dislike for this. The word Nicolaitans in the original New Testament Greek has 2 parts to it. It's the Nikola Laetas, to conquer the laity. So that is an yeah, it's right there in that little section right under the verse there, verse 6. So that the conquering of the laity was something Jesus himself was against when he spoke to John in the book of Revelation. Very important. He forbids that kind of power abuse over people that are under you. And notice Revelations 2, verse 2. I know thy works, and thy labor, and thy patience, and how thou canst bear them which are evil. That's the word that's put on here. Thou hast tried them that say they are apostles, and they are not, and hast found them to be liars. I was devastated. When I was in the talk, I didn't know any of these kind of verses. I knew nothing of them. I didn't learn about them there. After when I came out and I was going to school and I was having to study Greek and Hebrew and all that, these verses really made an impact. And then, of course, I appreciate Enroth's research when he did the Power Abuses article. He pointed out some very important things. And I'm going over this for those who leave a group and express what Lori expressed. I don't care if I go to hell. They can't be any worse than this. My concern is that there's power abuse going on there that should have never happened in the first place. Jesus himself addresses this, and so did the apostles that were commissioned after him, that this should not be happening. So, I just say that because you make your decisions on what kind of information you have. The quality of information affects your judgment. And are you making sound judgments? Sound judgments are handicapped by false indoctrination. And I really feel for people that are deceived, and it takes time to research things of this nature. It's not always easily available. Most of what I have come by has come through a lot of labor and study. Nobody came in with a pitcher of water and poured it in my head. It doesn't work like that. Quality of information really does affect what you do. So in 3 John 9 to 11, I wrote to the church, but Diotrephes, who loves to have preeminence among them, receives us not. And this is the Apostle John speaking. Wherefore, if I come and I will remember his deeds which he does, prating against us with malicious words. Some people know what that's like to go through that. And not content therewith, neither doth he himself receive the brethren, and forbids them that would, and cast them out of the church. Do you know what I find on these websites, these testimonials? I think they would recognize this. When they leave, they're forced to leave. They've labored, they've given their time, their money, their energy. And just like that, they're out. And they have no recourse inside the group. And a lot of it has to do with what's said about them. And they have no access to that. And if they try, if people have contact with them when they're trying to tell their story, they won't listen. I lost 2 very close friends of mine. And one of them came here to one came from New Hampshire here to Alaska. The relationship has never been able to be healed from what happened to us in my group and what happened from New Hampshire to here. So I know what it is firsthand. But again, things were said. You can't defend yourself. There's no, like if you have a court case, you can have some sense of justice. You can do that. But when Alan pointed out in his presentation is when the First Amendment comes into this, and freedom of religion and all of that. Another thing is when you give all your resources to a group or a cult, and you're out on the street, you don't even have a bus ticket. And there are a number of stories I've seen with this, with former members' testimonies and blogs that I have looked at. It's a very powerful thing. So, in terms of the Diotrephes part of it, to berate or to be mischievous, that's part of what Diotrephes was doing, to discredit people he didn't want in his group. I'm going to move on from there. Now, Juan Carlos Ortiz in Call to Discipleship, he's featured in this book, The Discipleship Movement. Now, I want to go to this graphic. Does anyone notice the difference between this part of the photograph and this part of the photograph?
They're all touching.
But do you notice the difference before and the after?
Everybody's smiling.
They're all doing different things on that side. This side, they're all performing.
Yeah, there you go. They start out as individuals. They go through this process in this machine, and they come out like clones of one another. Notice they're all the same. And that's the issue of the group identity versus individuality. And if God has put a rim around you and he has to rub it out, what are you left with? So the manifest sons of God relationship to the new apostolic submission, you will be left out into Babylon. Notice the black and white thinking that there's no halfway point. There's no compromise. So submitting to this is a big deal. That's why it was really crucial for me to go through those authority verses that criticize this kind of control over people that is forbidden. And it also relates to what Dr. Lifton talks about in his chapter 22. One of the things he recommends, as well as Walter Martin does in Scaling the Language Barrier, you restore words to their original meaning. When we speak the English language, if I say red, and I show you this computer, and I say this is a red computer, I think some of you would think, maybe I have some sort of psychosis going on here. Because it's obviously not a red computer. That's really important in terms of words and how they're used. And groups do redefine these things, and they become the Bible dictionary in many of the cults. They define what things are. So when you're dealing with groups that have a revelatory authority attached to them, the very Gnostic kind of approach to this type of learning, it really can wreak havoc with what you believe is true. Especially when groups back up their authority with all these mystical stories that they will tell you. I mean, I was in church services where they told me, I didn't see them, but people said they looked at angels looking down at us. There's all kinds of stories. I don't know in the move if you get those more exotic mystical stories, but I listened to quite a few. Like, one told me he saw John Robert Stevens' aura go through the ceiling. These are the kinds of experiences people will describe to you. So there's a spiritual authority on it. Also, one of the characteristics is a preoccupation with Satan and his work is another characteristic of a spiritually abusive group. Authoritarian leaders are often paranoid and typically respond to criticism by telling their followers that this is kind of a persecution, and it is further evidence that Satan has attempted to sabotage God's work. So the adversarial mindset is a really important one because of the paranoid polarization that it can create. When you look at the back of the dollar bill, I don't know if any of you have gone through this one, but do you see what's on this dollar bill? There's a pyramid here, and there's an eye on the top of it. Now, do you know what the background of this is? Why is this on the dollar bill? I didn't know anything about it. I knew nothing about the Illuminati or the Trilateral Commission or anything of this kind. But there was a book, and I think it's really a quality book because it researches conspiracy theories, and it has to do with where the history of this material comes from. And so you have to be really careful in terms of what you buy into. But this was a major element in the walk. It is what has separated us from the outside world. It had an effect on higher education. People would not go to college because they were going to be in Babylon, and they would be tainted by that institution. As I mentioned yesterday, seminary equated to cemetery, dead men's bones and white sepulchres. I mean, so you really have serious, highly reductive thinking about all this. So, when you get into the isolationist attitude, it has a serious impact on cult policy concerning relationships of a lifetime. Romantic and family relationships are especially impacted where group teaching and policy require permission through cult leaders of approval and direction. So the directed prophecy through the laying on of hands, I had a similar experience. I mean, people want to lay hands on me, I'm like this. I am that sensitive to it because it meant authority, and when you were under that, it controlled you completely. Not only that, if you disobeyed it, you could be subject to a public flogging. And I mean that in a psychological sense. Yeah. Emotionally, it is a very powerful control mechanism to make you compliant, and you're afraid to speak out for a number of reasons, not just one. Quality information is needed to break the ingrained constriction of occult doctrination and conditioning. Equipping former members with intellectual tools to undo the deception caused by the group that created the harm without the awareness of its true source. Like, I didn't know about the full history of the Latter-rain. I wish I had known it. I would have not joined that organization if I had known it, walking in those doors. It's kind of what Alan described when he walked in the door.
He didn't know this full range of what was in front of him. In most legal settings, informed consent has a contractual side to it, like the lemon laws. Do they have lemon laws in Alaska? You know, if you get a car in 72 hours, if it's, you know, somebody puts sawdust in your transmission, and it's starting to act up a little bit, you have recourse. Notice the informed consent laws and how they're structured with things that you buy. And certain kinds of contract law, where you have a time period where you can reflect and you can think, and you may find out other information saying, no, I don't no longer, you have recourse. This kind of thing is serious because if you don't have access, and there's two sides to it. The other side of milieu control that I didn't touch upon, which I will now, is your communication with yourself. You can't think just what you want to think. There's this process that you go through. And that's where the group comes in. They're mediating your thinking on various levels. Ideologically, they're mediating it because you're a true believer and you go along with that thinking, but also you're telling them what they need to know. You go to them. Not only them, but there's policies where you have to get permission. Am I going home for the weekend? And I see this commonly with families. The parents want to set up a family get-together. And so they talk to the son or daughter. The common rule that I've encountered is they go get permission, then they'll tell the family whether they can do it or not. They have to tell the group. They have to tell the leaders. So they need this permission-seeking mechanism to act on things, just on mundane things. In fact, one of the most difficult areas for some even walk-away former members is making choices, going to a restaurant, what are they going to eat? I remember one woman I worked with, she was in a group for 7 years, a guru group in New York, and it took us over a month. She had 4 dresses, and she was having a difficulty deciding a new dress. She had come to the point after wearing these 4 dresses for years. Now she needed to get some other. Just to go to Kohl's, she had to plan the trip. All this concrete decision-making took weeks for her to actually do it. And she had been recruited in South Street. I didn't ask to go along. She asked me to go along because she didn't feel it was safe. I held back because I felt it was important for her to make her own decision. And eventually she did, and now that phobia is history. She's not afraid now. She can do it without bad things are going to happen to her. So I explain these kinds of things as characteristics of how this kind of works. The unique end-time message. Yeah. Motivates members. Okay? It's a motivation to loyalty. Jim Jones was very, very clever with the way he did this. He had this set up where he left Indiana and went to Ukiah, then Ukiah to San Francisco Bay to Jonestown. And the entire end-time approach he took, it was apocalyptic with him. The whole thing that the blacks were going through at the time. We're talking when Jim Jones was really moving and becoming more powerful, was working with black people in black congregations that joined his church. And so he helped them get where there wasn't meat on the table before, now they're eating meat. He would help through all kinds of government services and agencies, got them cheese and all different, you know. It was great overhead savings for the group to get all this government funding through the agencies that were available for poor people. He desegregated the theater in Indianapolis. He was the first one to do it. He went there with about 50 of his people, and when the ticket owner looked at all the people that were with him, we don't have enough for the colored people that you have with you. And so, because he had become the commissioner, the housing commissioner there, he had become a city official, he was able to get them into that theater, and they sat in the white section, not just the black section. Well, that was historic. But that's the kind of influence he was able to exercise as a leader, and the way he would marshal their loyalty to him, where they were indebted to him for all these things he did for them. And he had a reputation for helping the poor. Jimmy Carter, his wife, Rosalind Carter, he campaigned with her. Walter Mondale, Vice President of the United States, with Jim Jones. Willie Brown, eventually became the mayor of San Francisco. I think he was a legislator at the time when Jim Jones, he praised him for his good works. It was only after his death that it was discovered that he had acquired $26 million in a Swiss bank account called Bridget. Ken Woodward, the one I think the one that Mark brought up yesterday, he's the one that revealed that. I remember him seeing, it was an ABC, he used to work with ABC, and he had done an ABC interview, and I remember seeing him disclosing that information. Okay, what I want to do before I conclude, I want to show you this video that'll give you a nice overview of some of the themes that I talked about yesterday and today. I was a member in my group at the same time Tony Cox was a member of the Walk. Tony Cox was the first husband of Yoko Ono. Does anybody know who Yoko Ono's second husband was? John Lennon of the Beatles. Does anyone know what happened to Yoko's daughter during those missing years? She was in the Walk. Tony had gone into the Walk and became a member. He was in there at the same time period I was in there. And so he asked me to join him in the production of Vainglory. Vainglory is a movie about the Walk. It's a documentary. And what I'm going to show you is the cult section. Now, if there was more time, I'd show you the whole thing, but it takes too much time for that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the cult section. And the reason why I'm going to do this, because it ties into my presentation as an overview. Did that just go off?
Can't we change that setting? Can't we change the setting so it doesn't keep going out?
Well, his computer's taking a little bit longer than ours.
It's not
That's a setting that you can make it longer,
Can't
yeah.
we change it?
Does the screen
Well, he
still
wasn't
on?
off that long though, was he?
Am I using yours for my phone?
Yeah, mine was, this won't go off. This,
I think I see it doing something. The light starts.
you gotta have two,
And it's blinking, so
Yeah,
I think
they take
I
time to
think
warm
I
up.
can do this.
try hitting it again, that's.
I am Mark.
There's the green light.